Thank you very much for inviting me today, and it's good to see from Farm Riders New South Wales that we're having beef. I was at a state luncheon for China's Premier Li Keqiang about 1.5 years ago in the Great Hall of Parliament House, and Australia and China, upon his visit, had just signed an agreement where China would buy more beef. And Li Keqiang, who's quite an amusing, funny sort of guy, comes into the Great Hall and talks to a few people, comes to the podium and says, "We have just signed a very big agreement for China to buy Australian beef, premium Australian beef. So I asked what we were having for lunch, and they said, chicken." He said, "Chicken? We're just buying all your beef and it's chicken." So the night after that, I was the president of the New South Wales Australia-China Business Council, and we offered to organise a big business, 600 people business forum here in Sydney. And he turned up, of course, with Malcolm Turnbull. I'm on the stage. Malcolm, "Hello, Craig." Sort of didn't think you'd be here. And I introduced Premier Li Keqiang, and I said, "If you just stay," I forget what we had, I think we had fish. And I said, "If you want to stay on, we can go to have a drink, but I know a really great beef place." He was very, very interested in that. But it does remind me of our white paper on Australia in the Asian century, which we released in 2012, and I'll come back to that and tell you a little bit more what we were thinking then and how that's unfolding. But before that, I thought I should establish a rite of passage with you as farm writers. I do come from the country. I come from a small country town called Barradine, wrote a book, in fact, called The Boy from Barradine. I'm sure you'd find it remaindered in a store near you. But it's a little bit indicative of what's happened, in rural New South Wales and rural Australia since I left, which was in 1970 when they put quotas on the cutting of cypress pine and ironbark because they had been overcut. And also quotas on wheat production. It was a very bad time. The town, and my father lost his job. He worked in Permuins, and that Permuins is a store that's very heavily dependent on demand from the surrounding properties. So we moved to Sydney. But it's what's happened since is kind of indicative of what's happened in regional Australia, and that is we used to talk about having to go to the big smoke, and the big smoke was Sydney. And back at that time, that's when people who had to leave Barradine, that's where they tended to go. The story's a bit better now, and you'd probably be aware of this, that it's not, that Barradine had 900 people, then it's got 400 people now. But it still sort of fights on, people are still cheerful enough and so on. But when there isn't any work, when the jobs go, as they did more recently with the closure of the last cypress pine sawmill, they tend to go to Dubbo and to Tamworth and maybe Gunnedah. So what's happening in regional Australia, certainly in New South Wales, is sure the smaller towns are getting smaller, and some like nearby Wobbegar are disappearing or so close to disappearing. But the regional towns are getting bigger, and I wrote a book in 2005 called Vital Signs, Vibrant Society. You won't even find that in the remainders sections anymore. But it was a story or a bit of a vision about providing not only economic infrastructure to those regional cities that were viable, but also social infrastructure, by which I mean hospitals and really good schools, because not only are people coming from those small country towns to those regional centres, the tree changers are a bit interested in coming from the overcrowded cities to those regional centres. But if you're thinking about moving, say, from here to there, you'd say, well, what's the school like? Or I've got an ageing mum or a dad, and I don't want to leave them in the city on their own. What's the aged care service like there? It sort of hasn't happened, but I think it can and should. I added to that the idea that for migrants coming to Australia, 80% of them still come to Sydney and Melbourne. But if you had a system, which actually did get put in place, which said that if you go from your home country to a region and you stay in that region for, and I'm going to say 3 years, then you will get permanent residency and then you can go for citizenship. That has been picked up, but it hasn't really succeeded because some bright people came up with the idea that pretty much everything outside Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane was a region. And I know South Australia did that. It just designated all of South Australia as a region. So the states were allowed to self-designate. But again, you might recall prior to the election, the coalition was talking about this. Now, we're not a country that says you have to live in a particular place for the rest of your life. But the idea of agreeing on your visa to come and live in a regional centre for 3 years would be you're bringing young children. They then become part of this, whether it's childcare, preschool, schooling and so on, and the incentive to stay where you are is much greater than if you came to Sydney and then you tried to get them to go to regional Australia. I still think that idea is right. It's just that we haven't properly implemented it. The next port of call is that white paper on Australia in the Asian century. I said to Prime Minister Julia Gillard, I think we should do this, and she said as soon as we get this carbon price in, she'll turn the whole cabinet onto that, and we released that only a few months later in November 2012. But working with Ken Henry and others, we were trying to envisage where Australia would be taking advantage of the opportunities of Asia's growth, but of course in particular China's growth and the growth of the middle classes in those countries, which brings us back to the Li Keqiang comments, because we saw a great future in agriculture for safe, clean, green, premium agricultural produce destined for the Asian markets and most particularly the Chinese market. And we actually had the opportunity subsequently to go and visit the Wagner airport at Toowoomba, where they're just flying in premium beef on pretty much a daily basis. And so that market's there. I got to know the Indonesian Trade Minister Gita Wirawan very well, and he commented that as the Indonesian middle class expands, this will be a huge opportunity. But at that time, it was a pretty sharp debate about Chinese investment in Australian agriculture. To the credit of the National Farmers Federation, I went to one of their annual conferences, and the leadership was actually supporting this, because the Chinese had the capital and we had the land, and farm consolidation was desirable to be able to produce at scale and quality and so on. So we saw that as the investment, Chinese investment in Australian agriculture, as being a positive. A few people like Barnaby Joyce said, no, it's a terrible idea. But interestingly, being candid with you, at that time, Chinese investors were saying, we need to own the properties. And then they finally worked out that they weren't farmers. And I think what's happening is that they've become more familiar and more confident with the supply chains, that they've been starting to think, we've had a few business people coming out trying to set up farms, and frankly, they're not very good at it. But Australians are really good at setting up farms. So I now have adjusted my view of that vision of the safe, clean, green, premium produce, still maybe requiring Chinese financial investment, but not necessarily Chinese ownership of all these properties, because they've become more confident. So I think that itself points to a very, very positive future in terms of the future demand for rural produce from Australia. We found be the food bowl of Asia. The idea of us producing lots of wheat and even rice and barley and so on. Big countries like China want to be self-sufficient in case there is some big problem in those basics, but they don't seek to be self-sufficient in Wagyu beef, for example, or any of the other premium agricultural products. So I think that's evolved, but having evolved, the future is as bright as we anticipated in the production of that paper. Also, to seek to establish my credibility with you, I'm now a member of the Crawford Fund, which John Anderson chairs. We're having our next meeting next week, actually in Canberra. The relevance of that is that our last meeting, which was about 6 months ago now, our guest speaker was Professor Ross Garnaut, who, again, in seeking to establish my credibility with you, is a good friend and was my PhD thesis supervisor at the ANU, and we've worked together for years and years and years. And Ross was talking about, again, a great future for regional Australia, with a lot of that, not dominant necessarily, but a lot of it tied up in a carbon-constrained future and the opportunities available to Australian farmers for sequestration to put carbon back into the ground or to keep it in the ground. And that you'll soon see is a key theme of what I want to talk to you about and seek to answer any questions that you might have. In preparing for those thoughts, I'm not asking anyone here or any farmer to believe in human-induced climate change. It's up to them what they believe. I believe in human-induced climate change, but they'd say, who cares what Emerson believes in? It's not about what you believe in, but what is unfolding. That is how the world is reacting to it. So to draw some parallels, I don't ask Australian farmers to believe in tariffs imposed by other countries. They are a constraint. Like, as an economist, they're a constraint. You don't have to say, well, you could say, I don't like tariffs. I just don't like them, or I don't believe there's climate change. They're just a kind of an economic reality, and that's, I think, the way to deal with this in terms of this, seesawing debate about, is climate change, human-induced climate change real? How serious is it? Is it a global left-wing conspiracy involved the Pope, the gnomes of Zurich, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, NASA, and the World Meteorological Organisation? It could be, but I don't think so. But in any event, my point is countries are behaving as if they believe that it's a real problem and will continue to behave as if they believe it's a real problem, because most of them do. So I think we can, in a sense, move on beyond the is it real, is it a conspiracy, is it real, is it a conspiracy. There are constraints that are going to be imposed by the world on Australia and on themselves that we just have to recognise. So that's the way I'd like to put it to you, and then just to do a thought experiment. What if Australia, for some reason, for political reasons or whatever, said, we don't want to be part of this. We just don't think it's right. The government of the day just says it is a hoax, it's a conspiracy. Well, contemplate carbon tariffs. It's interestingly, I've become really good at Googling, so I Googled carbon tariffs, green tariffs and meat, and I found that within a month of being made Trade Minister in October 2010, I was warning that countries would impose carbon tariffs. I did it in the context, frankly, of the European Union, because the EU doesn't need a lot of reasons to impose tariffs on the outside world. It's a free trade area within it, but we know, and I go so far back as to visiting Europe and the US, trying to get the Common Agricultural Policy and the Export Enhancement Program wound back. So they have a history of protection. What a great reason or pretext to put on tariffs is to say, well, you know what, here we are in Europe, we're doing the right thing by the planet, we're going to net zero by 2050 and maybe faster in case of many countries, but what we're supposed to be closing down our steel industry in Germany, but bringing in carbon-intensive steel from other countries. Most particularly, I think they'd be thinking China. But in terms of Australia, well, look, we don't sell a lot of steel into Europe, probably some colour-bond. I doubt that we'd sell much aluminium, actually, which would be the other one where we would be worried. But even I can certainly envisage the Europeans saying, well, long haulage in aeroplanes in particular, in the bellies of aeroplanes, involves a lot of carbon emissions. Maybe we should be penalising that. But this is what I thought in 2010. Late last year, the new head of the European Union is saying, well, of course we will. Of course we will. Why would we do this and, in a sense, disadvantage our steel industry and then say, oh, yeah, but the good news is we're bringing in steel that's used carbon-intensive processes in its production. The same thing happened at Davos in January. They've been talking about, I think it's extremely likely. I want to put this to you though, that's the EU. What about the US Congress? Well, we know that the US Congress, Republican and Democrat, have become very protectionist. In those days when I was travelling around with Bob Hawke, we met Ronald Reagan and we met George Bush Sr. Their instincts as Republicans were not protectionist. They were saying, we don't like doing this, but we've got to, push back against the Europeans. Nowadays, there's a very strong anti-Chinese sentiment in Washington, but right through the Congress. It's sort of a bipartisan thing. There's this sense that China has caused all these job losses, and that's why you're seeing these trade wars. You don't see a lot of Democrats saying this trade wars are a terrible idea, we're for free trade. So I don't know who's going to win the next election, presidential election. I was absolutely confident that Donald Trump wouldn't win the last one, and I said, if he did, I'd go to my bed and pull up the doona and have a look out after 4 years, and then he won. But I didn't go to the bed and pull up the doona. But the point is, it wasn't likely that he was going to win. So I don't know. Like if someone said, right, you study this, who's going to win? I don't know. But you'd have to say Trump has a pretty good chance, right? No one should say he can't win. And I reckon if we went around the room here, we would have more people saying Trump will win than anyone else. But if you're a presidential candidate from the Democrats running up against Trump, what are you going to say about tariffs and China? The same as Trump. And in fact, the Democrats traditionally have been more protectionist. Okay, now imagine that there's some kind of free trading president, which I find it hard to imagine, honestly, because the swing states that delivered for Trump are the states that need to swing back, the sort of Rust Belt states, to deliver a Democratic president. So they're now what we call the marginal electorates here in Australia. So I cannot see how the Democrats would say, we'll just give those up. So there'll be this competition for who's going to be a good protectionist in the US. So I can see a future in the United States, regardless of who wins the election at the presidential level, of a Congress which is quite protectionist against imports from China in particular. But when we have a look at what happened and has happened over the last 2 or 3 years, the US has put steel tariffs, that's got nothing to do, on the EU. It put them on Mexico, I think, and Canada until they sorted that out. They put a tariff on Whirlpool washing machines. Now, why would you do that? Why would you? And I thought, I'll look up where Whirlpool operates in the United States, the state of Wisconsin. Guess what? That's one of the states that flipped. So I think we are in for an era of, competitive protectionism. And in those circumstances, I can see a Congress using whatever pretext it chooses and whatever is convenient. And if you're a democratic representative in the Congress, what better argument to say, well, it's unfair and we're getting this carbon-intensive tariffs goods coming in from China and other countries. So sorry to be glum about that, but I think we are in a world of protectionism for at least the next few years. So given that this is the way the world's moving, particularly the Paris Agreement talks about zero net emissions by 2050, something close to 100 countries have already adopted it. Here in Australia, even in the last few months, the Labor opposition adopted it a week or so ago. Major corporations are adopting it. The Business Council of Australia has actually set, not only do we think that we should be adopting a target of zero net emissions by 2050, we should legislate it. We should legislate it. This is a big change for the Business Council of Australia. And the reason they say we should legislate it is that that creates a more predictable environment, even if some people don't like that environment. It reduces the uncertainty of one government saying we're for it and then another government, we're going to rescind it, which you could, but it becomes pretty politically difficult, in my view, when you've got the Business Council of Australia and the AIG, I think the Meat and Livestock Corporation, maybe the NFF, I'm not sure, BHP, Rio, and a raft of AGL, Santos, a raft of companies are committing to this target of zero net emissions by 2050. So the last thing I want to do, last topic, is to just give you a bit of a sense of what that could look like. The biggest sector for emissions, as we know, is electricity. We have an ageing fleet of coal-fired power stations. Not one of the owners of a coal-fired power station has said we're going to build another one to replace the one we've got. Haven't even thought about that. It's just, we are not going to do that. There is no other proponent of a coal-fired power station from the private sector, other than the one at Collinsville, where they would in the end require an indemnity against changes in carbon prices. They've no doubt require, I don't think they're going to get $2 or $3 billion of spare change together for that. The only way that could happen is if the government stepped in and said, we will make sure you get this minimum price for all the electricity discharged from the Collinsville power station. This cost-benefit analysis is being commissioned, but I don't think that the Morrison government is going to sign up to that. In the absence of that, no new coal-fired power station from the private sector, no new coal-fired power station from the government sector, no new coal-fired power station. The most recently built coal-fired power station in the national electricity market is Cogan Creek. It was built in 2007. Think of 2050, that's let's do the maths. 2007, it's 43 years old in sorry, thank you. Stage fright. 43 years old in 2050. The last set of coal-fired power stations that have gone out in the last 5 years, their average life was 42 and a half. Right, so that coal-fired power station will be gone. That's the newest one. All the ones before it will be gone, based on this, I think, very reasonable analysis. Well, what the big thing, only need Malcolm Turnbull to stand here, is storage. We won't get into all the technology, but there will be a role for gas as a transition fuel, open cycle, then combined cycle. There'll be snowy hydro, whether we love it, hate it, or whatever. It just looks like it's going to happen. There'll be more pump storage. There'll be more investment in batteries. And so the future for that large section of the emissions is basically a carbon neutral future to 2050. The second is motor vehicles. No, you're not going to lose the utes. They're still going to be there. The four-wheel drives and so on, and the Aussie weekend as we know it I'm going to predict, with great technological certainty, will still occur. in 2050. It might be a different Aussie weekend, but we're still going to have those Aussie weekends, so fear not. But there will be increased penetration from electric vehicles. I'm not a technologist, but the way that they tend to enter markets is flat, 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 and then whoosh. And I think that is a plausible scenario, but I'm not going to predict what this scenario will look like in 2050. Then there's other sectors of the economy, and we could go through each of these, but I want to leave you on a very, very positive note. To the extent that there are companies, businesses, operations are still emitting carbon in 2050, what does this farming community stand to do? Gain massively, in my view. Not only by the companies that we've already in the last few weeks said committing to net zero emissions, which means they might have emissions, they're going to go to the farming community and they are going to contract as consenting adults for farmers to leave some of their properties or all of their properties if they wish, maybe more grazing country than premium cattle raising country, and say, look, we will pay you to allow eucalypts and acacias to grow on your properties. Now, I see the benefit of Australia doing that, obviously being that we've got a lot of land and we're authentic, right? You can make these certificates really roll gold. I think they already exist in terms of the current regime. But if you've got an Australian certificate that says this certificate is worth 1 tonne of carbon sequestered, that will be very, very, and governments can stand behind it to authenticate it. I'd rather have that from Australia than from, let's say, a less reputable country in the world where those certificates may or may not be considered to be absolutely roll gold. So I see an enormous opportunity on Australian lands, as I say, probably more the marginal lands, maybe from where I come from, a bit further out, and farmers are being told, we want to pay you to allow trees to grow on your property. They could still keep some of the grazing, but on the hills and all that sort of thing. So that's where I want to close, because I think on top of our white paper on Australia in the Asian century, which is very, very positive for regional Australia, including regional migration, this could be a massive new opportunity for the Australian rural community. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Craig, for that excellent presentation. I think we can agree that Craig did very effectively establish his credibility amongst this very Aggie audience. And I, for one, am glad that you weren't stuck under the doona for the past however many years it was, 4 years, 3.5 years at this point, and that you were able to be here today to give us, to offer such excellent insights. For me, I think your analysis of the likelihood of ongoing protectionist urges from the United States and in response some of the other big economies is disturbingly convincing. And it's a real downer because I thought that we'd won that argument 25 years ago, But your analysis of the future of Australia in a renewable energy world offered some real hope. What seems clear to me here is that the loss of Craig to the front line of Australian representative politics is a really sad one. And there might be others who didn't argue otherwise, but I for one think that your thoughtfulness and the fact that being a fellow economist gave your speech some real legs for me. So would you join me in thanking Dr. Craig Emerson for his contribution today?